science is based on, you've all heard of hypothesis, right? Scientific hypothesis. You've heard of theories, and you've heard of scientific laws. Now, unfortunately, some people think that you go from a hypothesis to a theory to a law. That would make sense, but that's not how it works. There are laws, like the law of gravity, thermodynamic laws, and things like this. They either support your theory or they don't. So it's like on its side. But they're very strong. I mean, if your theory goes against the law, you have a problem, okay? Because laws are laws. In other words, they're things that we see all the time. In a particular environment, it always works out. Gravity always works, right? Unless you're in a very, very strange situation. Gravity, you always go towards the center, right? Towards the earth. Otherwise, we'd be sort of floating around here. That happens at the rapture, but God has like an anti-gravitational process. Then there are theories. So then you have a hypothesis. So you come up with ideas, and then you test the ideas, and you get to a hypothesis. Okay? So what we're going to do is we're going to hypothesize about these two spheres. Now, I call them spheres because many years ago I was giving a talk to 150 youth in a Presbyterian church, youth. And I passed these around. I used to call them the black balls. And what I'll do is I'll start passing them around, and you'll look at them and analyze them. And after 45 minutes, they hadn't come back. So I glibly said to 150 teenagers, "Who's got my balls?" And so now I don't call them balls anymore. I call them spheres. So there's no confusion in case I want to find out where they are again. All right. So now one of them has a little white dot. It used to be a bigger one, but it's sort of worn off. Has a little white dot. In fact, and one of them's maybe a little bit bigger now. They both are black spheres, but one of them has a little bit of a white dot, okay? Now, the question we're going to ask is, which one will bounce the highest when we test it? Okay, that's the question. Now, that means I don't want you to bounce it. We're going to all do it together at the end, all right? It's very important for it to say a hypothesis. You're not going to test it. Do you promise? Everybody promise? Not going to test it? Good. What do scientists bring from themselves to do science? Ideas, imagine. Okay, but what else? What's more physical realm? Observation. How do we observe things? Yeah, the senses. So what are the senses? How do we... that's not senses. You're closer here. Eyes. Eyes. What else? Touch. Ears. Hearing. Smell. Taste. Okay. God's given us a way of discovering His creation. For the benefits of everybody, I would suggest not tasting these. But you can use your other four senses to try to figure out your hypothesis of which is going to bounce the highest when we test it, okay? And we'll do this while I'm talking. So you just pass it around, sir, and eventually it'll end up hopefully back here somewhere. So whoever gets it back there, bring it up to the front to the gentleman here. All right, and remind me at the end of this talk to do this testing, okay? Don't forget, we'll do the test. All right, a debate is a formal discussion on a particular topic in a public meeting or legislative assembly in which opposing arguments are put forward. And so, this is evidence for creation. So what this is showing here is that we're both dealing with the same evidence. We both have the same fossils, but we're coming to different conclusions. So how are we going to work that? Because obviously it's not just based on the evidence. The evidence is the same for both of us. Now, let me explain what evolution is. And I'm going to be blocking someone here. I don't know how far over. Maybe I should move over a bit further. Let me just try moving. And if someone could get me some water, I would really appreciate it. It would be very kind. Okay. Evolution. All life on Earth is descended from a last universal common ancestor, what they call a Luca. Now, that is just right now being put into question, but that's what's the official description. That lived approximately 3.8 billion years ago. That's also being changed now. But anyway, evolutionary processes give rise to diversity at every level of biological organization, including species, individual organisms, molecules such as DNA and proteins. Okay, here's a key to this situation. When people talk about, I heard a talk by Stephen Gould at McGill University thank you very much, where he talked about evolution, and he talked about the evolution of history, he talked about the evolution of a basketball team, he talked about the evolution of dogs, and then he talked about the evolution of the Cambrian fauna, and that's from single cell to trilobites. And the thing is that each definition of evolution is different. So do I agree that there could be evolution of a basketball team? Of course. There can be a progression. Do I believe that there's evolution within dog species? sort of. I call it adaptation, but we could call it microevolution. Do I believe frogs can become princes in 150 years? No. Okay, so that's when I'm talking about evolution. There's a difference, because he talks about species, individual organisms, and then all of a sudden he's down to DNA and proteins. And here's another issue. DNA and proteins don't reproduce. How are you supposed to evolve DNA and proteins? So evolution becomes very, englobes everything. See, this is the idea. They'll say evolution doesn't talk about it doesn't talk about the origin of life. That's hogwash. That's ridiculous. All the textbooks talk about the origin of life. Darwin talked about the origin of life. He didn't just talk about speciation. And so you start 5 billion years ago, and you end up with men at the top, monkeys, and all kinds of things at the end. And life shows up only at the very end. Well, it shows up a little bit earlier, and now it's actually getting earlier and earlier now. This part that's here, just last month, has been moved back to here, which makes it really, really difficult, because it was already difficult to get a single cell at all, but try to get it earlier makes it even more improbable. So the mechanisms they have, as in every theory, they have mechanisms. So the mechanism is natural selection and mutagenesis, we'll see. So natural selection is the only known cause for adaptation, but not the only known cause for evolution. Other non-adaptive causes for evolution include mutation and genetic shift. So it's going to be a combination of natural selection, I'll explain what it is a little later, and of changes in the mutation code. And genetic shift means changes of the population genetic code, depending on ecological niches. And if I've lost everybody already, oh well, it'll get easier. The directing principle of the creation theory is what? Is to explain the origin of the complexity. This is the vital difference. See, once you can wrap your head around this is the key. It's the key to talking about origins. We do not need to explain the changes within a species. God said they reproduce after their kind. So we're all in agreement of all the, what's a kind? A wolf, a fox, a dog, a jackal, coyote. Those are all the same kinds. They all descend from a common ancestor, wolf-type ancestor that was on the ark. We have no problem with that. We agree. Okay? But where we say you have to have a creator is the origin of things. How do you get the first cell? How do you get the first wing? How do you get the first eye? How do you get any of these systems? You don't just you can't just move a little bit at a time. So basically, we say the origin of the complexity and the functional organization of the universe and life through an intelligent cause. That's what we're saying, is that's summarizing the creation model. An organized system always requires information, so you have intelligence plus matter plus energy will give you life. And so that's what we're saying. In the evolutionary theory, they have matter and energy gives life over time. They're missing the intelligence. Okay, you can see the essence of life is information, right? You're basically walking genetic codes. Well, you may think you're more than that. God thinks you're more than that, but I'm just a geneticist, so you're just walking genetic codes. I'm joking. But you are information. You're the expression of the information that God has put in that very first cell. See, that whole question of when are you human? That's not a debate. As soon as that cell has fertilized, that code is the same as what you have now. You're just as fully human there as you are now. You just have more of the same code. And the essence of information is an intelligent cause. In other words, we've never seen a system that contains information that its cause was not intelligence. That's what SETI is about. SETI is the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. They want just 4 little dots. Beep, 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 beep. Oh, there's intelligence out there. I can show them a lot of dots on the genetic code. It's like they have one level of analysis for telescopes and a different level of analysis for microscopes. But if they were used to say the same criteria that they use for telescopes on their microscopes, they'd say, wow, there's a lot of intelligence here. Got codes. Even your Oxford professor, your happy atheist from this island, biology is the study of complicated things that give the appearance of having been designed for a purpose. Yes. I sort of agree with them. All right. Who knows what this is? A platypus. I probably mispronounce everything for you, and you probably say evolution, which I love because it sounds like evolution. But I'll say evolution because it's the way we pronounce it. This is a platypus. Now, I love starting debates with questions. You see, platypus is a very interesting creature. He has the beak of a duck, the tail of a beaver. He has mink fur like a mink. He has palm feet. Venom comes out of his hind legs. He lays eggs, or she lays eggs, and milks their young. It's sort of like the Creator took everything that was left over on the shelves on day 6 and said, oh, here's a whoa, platypus. They're not very big. Well, actually, they found one that was a meter just a few months ago, and it's fossilized. So I like to ask my evolutionary colleagues, please explain. I don't have a problem. I'm a creationist. You explain that. And they finally came up with an idea on my 15th debate or something. They came up and said, oh, this is a transition. I said, okay, from what to what? Choice is unlimited here, and the fossils show up in the wrong time because platypus fossils show up 35 million years ago. Now you'll notice as I go through, I'm only going to quote evolutionists. Why? Because what I want to do is take their logic to its fullest extent. When they see that their logic is void of content, then opens them up to other possibilities. If I just try to superimpose my belief in creation on top of their belief in evolution, I'm just going to hit a wall. They have to become convinced and understand the weaknesses in their belief system before they're going to consider another belief system. Okay? So, here's what we're going to do. We're going to look quickly at refutability, predictions, just really, really quickly. And then we're going to get into the fun stuff, the scientific arguments that support the creation model. Okay? Which we're going to go through: sudden appearance, species stability, life, and irreducible complexity. Okay. So what's a hypothesis? You're all doing hypothesis with my little, are those little black spheres around here somewhere? Where'd they get to so far? All right, keep them going. A hypothesis is empirical or scientific only if it can be tested by experiment. Oh, okay. So it's only scientific empirical. This is from an evolutionist called biological evolution. A hypothesis or theory which cannot be, at least in principle, falsified by empirical observations and experiments does not belong in the realm of science. Now, this isn't accepted by everybody, but I'll take it on. And the idea is, if you can't show a way of disproving your theory doesn't have much validity. Okay, so we'll look at that. That's called refutability. So how do we refute the creation model? Well, the creation model would lose credibility if we observed in nature plasmid membranes, DNA molecules, and the enzymes necessary for their synthesis forming spontaneously, coexisting, and interacting. Right? If they started just appearing on their own, because that's what's supposed to have happened, that would disprove, because God doesn't say he did it that way. That would disprove the creation. So we can refute it. There's other things, but we'll just go with that one for the moment. We'll keep it. And every theory is only as good as its predictions. Right? It has to be useful in science, has to be able to predict. So here's a prediction from the creation model, from the Genesis model. The living and fossil worlds must present a strong discontinuity. That means that there's going to be breaks between the kinds. God says they will reproduce after their baramin, after their kind. So that means there's going to be a break between kinds. It's not going to be a continuum. Okay, everybody follow that? So the key word, discontinuity. See, creationists look for differences, evolutionists look for similarities between the major groupings of life forms. So the creation process implies a distinct appearance of multiple creations. In other words, the distinct creations find their source in a creator, not one from another, until we get back to a single Luca. Okay? So let's start with the first one. We got a prediction. We can refute it. Let's see what the evidence holds. Is there, in the fossil record in the living world, is there evidence for discontinuity? Well, the first discontinuity we're going to look at is, where did life come from? Now, this is the law of biogenesis. It's called life comes from life. In the 1668, Francisco Redi demonstrated that when you had a piece of meat, it didn't transmutate or spontaneously generate into maggots and flies. He isolated the meat and then there were no more maggots or flies because they didn't have microscopes. So they didn't know that these were laying eggs here and the eggs were showing, right? So they just sort of saw it as transmutation. And if you remember, the whole concept in the Middle Ages, and even earlier perhaps, was this alchemy idea that we can get gold from something else, right? The goose laying the golden egg, right? So this idea of transmutation was even in the biological realm. And so this was sort of a transmutation, and he said, no, that's not what's happening. If the meat is dead, it's dead. And there's nothing coming out of it. Now, before Francisco Redi, here was a way of creating life. And this is a true recipe for creating life. You have old underwear, and you add wheat hulls, and you put this in an open recipient. And what happens after 21 days, works every time, you get a whole family of mice. Okay? Whoops. Happens every time. And so it would appear that there's some transmutation going on here. And it works. It's scientifically observable, except if you close the recipient, of course, it doesn't work anymore. So, life comes from life. Now, later on, there came the question of, could it happen with bacteria? Maybe bacteria can spontaneously arise. And so Louis Pasteur, who was a top scientist, a top theologian, for 5 years, he studied the question of microbiological formation. And he demonstrated scientifically after 5 years that when a bacteria is dead, it's dead. It's not going to get alive. And you can't take material and have a bacteria appear. He published in 1859. I find that fascinating. Does that year ring a bell to any of you, 1859? What else was published in 1859? The Origin of Species. It's sort of like the Holy Spirit gave us right away 2 choices. Life comes from life, or you just evolved from a bacteria. You're just stardust. Okay, so life comes from life. Let's repeat it. I'm going to ask you to repeat a few things. You walk out of here, you'll still remember some of what I've said today. Let's repeat it. Life comes from life. Ready? 1, 2, 3. Life comes from life. All right. Law of biogenesis. Right away, that's a really... Now, I'm not going to solve something you've probably lost a lot of sleep over, and the question we're going to solve right now is which came first, the chicken or the egg? Now, this is a very important thing to solve. Why don't we have a vote? Who thinks the egg came first? Who thinks the chicken came first? Who's waiting for the right answer to lift up their hand? Okay, all right. Well, actually, you see, my bachelor's is in agriculture. I grew up on a farm. And I can tell you that, yes, chickens lay eggs, but that egg isn't going to do anything on its own. In actual fact, to have anything happen to that egg, you got to have a rooster. You don't get an egg that does anything unless you have a chicken and a rooster. This should not come as a great revelation to you, but it's a very important thing to remember because it all of a sudden makes this question nonsensical. The question is only, where did the rooster and chicken come from? It's not an egg. And that's not my problem. I'm a creationist. All right. This is what Darwin says. You have a Temple of Darwin down the road there, Natural History Museum. Why, if all species are descended from one another through subtle changes, do we not see innumerable transitional forms? In other words, he's saying there's discontinuity. I don't see the transitions. Why is nature not in confusion instead of being so well defined in species? Even Stephen Gould says this, the evolutionist, the extreme rarity of transitional forms in the fossil record persists as a trade secret of paleontology. That means people who study fossils, they know this issue. The evolutionary trees that adorn our textbooks have data only at the tips. The rest is inference, however reasonable, not the evidence of fossils. Most species, says Gould, exhibit no directional change. Oh, no change? During their tenure on Earth. They appear in the fossil record looking much the same as when they disappear. Morphological change is usually limited and directionless. He says, no matter what local zonation, wherever they are, species do not appear gradually, rather they appear suddenly and fully formed. Now, which model is this supporting? The creation model or the evolutionary model? Of course. why, this guy is was a top evolutionist in the world at Harvard, and yet this is not getting into the textbooks. It's been published in 1977, hasn't changed. This is what he's talking about, this sudden appearance. Now, as a Christian, as a creationist, in a biblical model, we would call it sudden disappearance. Think of the flood. But for the sake of argument, let's talk about sudden appearance. So this is the Cambrian explosion. In fact, I have a trilobite here. These are real fossils, so be careful with them. If you come up, sort of look at them, but don't touch them maybe. I have here a trilobite from Morocco, and it has eyes, and if you get close enough, you'll see the eyes are multiple eyes like those of a fly. This is the beginning of life for evolutionists. This is 600 million years old. It doesn't say that, but that's what they say. And so, how do you get eyes at the very beginning? Eyes are sort of complex. And then you get multiple eyes that correct for refraction. So I bring this, and I'm not an evolutionist. So I'm at the debate, and I put this in front of Dr. Cyril Barrett of the University of Laval, and I said, who's the head of the Department of Biology, and I say, what is primitive about this organism? He says, I'm not a specialist in trilobites. A cop-out. Doesn't make any sense. Eyes appear out of nowhere. Discontinuity. Everything appears. Boom. And it gets worse than that. This is supposed to be the hard facts wall for evolution. So here you have some fossils, and here you have the pieces of wood, you have some magnifying glasses, and you have strata. This strata is supposed to represent age and time, right? So if you take this is what they're trying to say. The corals are older than the vertebrates. Excuse me. Right? That's what they're trying to say with that. But in reality, let's put their ages. I don't believe in those ages, but I'm just putting their ages on for argument. The corals are supposed to be 440 million years old. The vertebrates are 450 million years old. Do you see a problem there? Sure, we see a problem. And under the magnifying glasses are nothing. So, this is what it should look like. Everything appears suddenly. All the different species, most species of life appear. In fact, Darwin's predictions are this. You can't see that, but I have a little red dot. But anyway, if you start with one type of life, that's a phyla, you're going to go to many different types of life. And so you start with this bacteria, and then you end up with more and more differences in the life forms. That would be the prediction from the theory. But if we look at the fossils, it's the opposite that occurs. Everything appears suddenly, 570 million years ago, about 600 million years ago, the Cambrian explosion, and then we lose after that. And all these different life forms, all these different families, which basically cover all major groups that exist now, they appear and disappear and don't change, just like Stephen Gould said. Where's the evolution? What we see there is they reproduce after their kind. That's what we see. We don't see evolution in the fossil evidence. This is from Pour la Science, a recent in 2002. The appearance and, more importantly, the diversification of numerous large zoological groups at the dawn of the Cambrian remains what Darwin has already described as a serious difficulty in the history of evolution. Darwin tried to explain this event, paleontological event, by suggesting that the fossil record was incomplete. But this argument is no longer tenable, as we now have complete geological series from the Precambrian to the Cambrian, and yet we continue to notice the very sudden appearance of fauna. So, here's the issue. Non-living matter to cells. Life comes from life. So how do you get non-living matter? It's dead. Right? It doesn't work. Bacteria to different types of cells, to eukaryote cells. It's a massive jump. There's no way of doing it. Invertebrates to vertebrates, no backbone to backbone. Unicellular to multicellular organisms. Insects. Even they don't know where they came from. They just, poof, insects. Wingless insects to winged insects. How do you do that? See, Stephen Gould expresses it very well here. He says, in what way could one start with nothing and finish with something complicated if evolution must follow a series of small intermediate steps, each step being an evolutionary advantage? This is what they're trying to make us believe. You see, the problem is, how could you fly with 2% of a wing? You can't. In other words, how could natural selection develop these small changes? It's a dilemma. How do you get this gradual? Which meant that Stephen Gould, he will promote another idea. He'll promote an idea that saltation, a jumping evolution that we'll get to in a moment. Natural selection can act only on the biological properties that already exist. So here's the key. Remember, there are two basic mechanisms for evolution: natural selection, mutagenesis. Natural selection only selects for the on the information that's already there. Let's make an example. Let's split this in half. So let's pretend you have the populations for strength and you have the populations for intelligence. You have the genes for intelligence, you have the genes for strength. Together you make a population that survives well. So then you have a really, really, well, not here because of course you believe in healing, but let's pretend you didn't. So you had a really bad cold go through, stress or something, and 24 hours, you're gone. Who's likely to survive? The strong ones. That's natural selection. You're gone. Sorry, had to pick one side. So you're gone. You're all happy I put intelligence, eh? Yeah, I tricked you. So you're gone. That's natural selection. But have you advanced your population? You've just adapted, but you haven't added more information. You're not going to get a new organ out of this. You're not going to, you understand? People say, well, what do you do with vestigial organs? I have an answer to that. Most of them we don't take out anymore. But what do I care about vestigial organs? Those are things that are leaving. I want to know what's coming in. Right? If the evolution is true, I want to know where's all this new information for new stuff. No new stuff. This, unfortunately, is still today in textbooks. Modern giraffes have long necks because some of their shorter-necked ancestors had to stretch their necks to reach leaves high in trees during the times of food scarcity. What? You can just add valves. You can add, they have 7 valves to keep their head from exploding from the pressure of their heart when they go down to drink. They just, there's not enough leaves. I'm going to add a valve. What? This muscular activity required activation of more genes, and corresponding incremental activity induced changes to those genes. Really? Which were then transmitted to the offspring. How did they do that? You have a mouse, you cut the tails off. Don't do this at home. You cut their tails off, and they have offspring. Those offspring are going to have tails. Right? How did they pass that on? Continued activity of this kind over many generations led to the longer necks we see. What? You're telling me trees all of a sudden had no more leaves at low levels anymore? That's not coherent. You got to be desperate. That's in teachers. That's the instructions to American biology teachers 2013. That's being taught now. The biology teachers have to teach this. And yet Stephen Gould in 1996 says the spotty evidence gives no insight into how the long-necked modern species arose. The standard story, in fact, is both fatuous and unsupported when talking about the giraffe. 1996, I think there's been enough time for it to filter down into our teachers' manuals. Shame. Mutations. Well, how do you want a system? We know what mutations cause. They cause problems. There are 3 systems on the genetic code to correct for errors so that when it's being reproduced, which happens many times, I'll show you a film later on, hopefully, it shows you all these different ways of correcting, and just one mistake and you get all these issues. Now, there are parts of the genetic code that are pre-programmed to allow change. Otherwise, we'd all be clones. God has done that for variability. And it helps us also adapt to different environments. And so there are parts of our genetic code, and epigenetics is finding more about this, they're hotspots. They're made to change. So they allow changes. But there are other parts, you put something in there, and you have cancer. Because it doesn't know where the stop code is. And it just keeps reproducing, using up all the available new elements, and then you die. Human genetic entropy is increasing. That's disorder. 3 to 5 fitness decline per generation. That's a big, big problem. And this has been published in 2010. With the inability of mutations of any type to produce new genetic information, so you're changing existing information, but you're not creating anything new. The maintenance of the basic plan is to be expected. There are limits to biological change, and these limits are set by the structure and function of the genetic machinery. In other words, God pre-programmed the limits into the system. This man here, Dr. John Sanford, wrote an excellent book called Genetic Entropy and the Mystery of the Genome, where he explains, and it's sort of depressing, how each generation has 100 mutations, and so you keep every generation adding to those mutations because they're near neutral. I mean, if they're not neutral, you die. So you're not passing, the real serious ones aren't being passed on, but the neutral ones, or semi-neutral ones, are being passed on, right? Because the other ones aren't, because you die, so you don't pass them on. So the ones that are near neutral are the most dangerous because they accumulate over time. And so it's like having a book where you have a typo in the page, And then the next edition, you have a few more. You can still read the page. And then the next edition, by the time you get to the 10th edition, it's gibberish. And you can't go, how are you going to get back to the first page? You can't. You have no way of getting back. That's actually the way the whole human species is going. I understand people who don't have hope outside. They need a message. The creation message is a message of hope. From Genesis on, it's a message of hope. It recognizes that the world is fallen. It recognizes suffering. It recognizes that things are not as God planned it to be. And that we're dealing with a fallen world, and that is why we need Jesus. And it only makes sense. If you say that Genesis isn't really what it's supposed to say, it's just poetry, Jesus doesn't make any sense anymore. And he says, this is the way the genetics are going. So when God says eventually he has to make a new heavens, new earth, because he really does. He really will. Things are going downhill fast. Okay, species stability. We do not have enough time. Okay, here is frogs. They haven't changed in 100 million years. Frogs are frogs. Remember when I said frogs become princes? I asked the evolutionists, I say, you really believe that frogs can become princes in 150 million years? They say, oh, never thought about it that way. Yeah. I just asked them the questions. It's up to them. It's not my theory. It's theirs. I'm not on the defensive about creation. Why would I believe their theory until they give me some evidence that it's true? Do you understand? I'm not trying to defend the creation theory. Everything around me demonstrates the creation theory. Everything. Fossils, living. Salamanders haven't evolved in 161 million years. They just haven't evolved. This guy is in your museum. You go into the Natural History Museum. First display on the left, I believe, on the first floor, I believe, is the coelacanth. I love it. I love it. I love it. Only God could arrange that. Because the coelacanth is supposed to be a fish, you see, that before they found the live one, that was a transition form. It was a form that was planning to get out of the water, and these were limbs that were actually developing on it. Okay, and that was believed and that was published. 1938, they find a dead one in a boat. So it's living. I mean, it's living somewhere in the world. So then there's now a website called dinofish.com where you can actually see videos of it and you can see it. A very interesting creature. One of the most fascinating things about this creature is it lives at 300 meters below the surface. It's not a really good candidate for coming out on the beach. In fact, when they brought it up to the surface, it kept dying on them because it couldn't cope with the change of pressure. Really bad candidate, actually. It has it has a nose that it can feel the magnetic. I think it feels its the prey or whatever it wants to see around it using magnetic fields. A very advanced creature. And here's the fascinating thing about this creature. The fossils appear 350 million years ago. Evolutionary years. They disappear 90 million years ago, but it's still alive. How do you do that? I don't have to answer that. I keep asking them, how do you leave fossils for 200 million years, and in the last 100 million years, you don't leave anything, but you're still there? Many other creatures left fossils over the last 100 million years, evolutionary years. How do you do that? That isn't coherent. Now, here's their answer, because they do have a escaping clause. What do you do with this issue of the species being sudden? Dr. Stephen Stanley and Dr. Stephen Gould developed this idea of neo-Darwinism, new Darwinism, where this is what they say. Established species are evolving so slowly that their major transitions between genera and higher taxa must have occurred within small, rapidly evolving populations that leave no legible fossil record. Okay, let's think this through for a second. They notice that we don't see anything evolving today, and we don't see anything evolving in the fossil record. So instead of saying, oh, maybe God created things, they said, no, what must have happened is all the species, they evolved really, really quickly, so fast, they never left any fossils. So if I understand this correctly, the proof of your theory is no fossils. How am I supposed to debate that? If I find a fossil, that's proof. If I find no fossil, that's proof. Is it possible to refute a theory like that? It has become irrefutable, unfalsifiable. It is not science anymore. Okay, very quickly. The smallest organism, they can't really live on its own, has 468 genes, average length of 1,000 bases, so 468,000. They decided to take apart bits and see how far they could get it down. You know, a car can run without a roof, call it a convertible, can run without, without tires, I guess. You could take off the bumpers, but you can't take the motor out, right? Certain things you have to have for a car to be a car. So this bacteria has to have certain things to keep it functional and alive. They managed to get down to 250, and I predicted that's not going to be enough. And they said 250. I said, no, that's not going to be enough. And I published this. I said, no, it's going to be more than that. Because that's in a theoretical perfect environment, but nothing lives in a perfect environment. So what they really found out a couple of years later was that it's 397. So the most simple organism on Earth has a DNA chain that's 397,000 parts. And when I say a part, that part is actually made up of parts, but let's make things easy. How do you start things off with 397,000 parts without intelligence in a specific order? You know, you have that nice song, I like it a lot, Awesome God. I love that song. When you start getting into this, you just start saying, wow, God's too much. God knows nothing of lack. He knows nothing of smallness, and he knows nothing that's limited. It isn't part of his reality. He goes overboard in everything. And Darwin says this about the eye. Suppose that the eye, with its inimitable contrivances for adjusting the focus to different distances, for admitting different amounts of light, and for correction of spherical and chromatic aberration, could have been formed by natural selection. Seems, I freely confess, absurd in the highest sense. Chapter 6. He spent a couple of pages trying to figure out how it could happen. Basically couldn't find the answer and said they'll find it in the future. But no, in the future it's just become worse. As we know things that Darwin didn't know, as our science has advanced beyond the science that Darwin had, his theory has become worse off. We know more about the fossils. What have we found? They're discontinuous. We know more about the cell. What have we found? It's much more complex than he could ever imagine. We know more about DNA. It can't come around on its own. Everything we find out every day. You know, when Romans 1, when Paul says, they are therefore without excuse. You say, how could they be without excuse? How can you look at that and not relate that to a creator? How? Okay, let's go to irreducible complexity. I showed this to a few people. Now, this is fascinating to me. This fact, well, I call it the signature of God. I have here, let's do a little vote. Who thinks the house is more complex than the skyscraper? Just lift up your hand. Okay. Who thinks the skyscraper is more complex than the house? Okay. Who's waiting for the right answer? Lift up their hands. Yeah, I still see you. You can't get away there. All right. Okay. Someone who thinks the skyscraper is more complex than the house, many of you lift up your hand. Just someone, tell me why. Foundation? It's a more complex foundation. Has to be deeper. It's bigger. Bigger doesn't mean more complex necessarily, but could be. Up higher, yeah. And it's like multiple houses. So what's interesting is you didn't have to take a university course to figure that out. In fact, I suspect if we put children in here, 8 or 9 years old, and ask them the same question, you get about the same percentages. So that means we're pre-coded to recognize complexity. Dogs don't recognize. Well, I must admit my communication with my dog is sort of limited, but as sit, lie, run, fetch. But, so I don't have great philosophical conversations with my dog, and he doesn't seem to be too interested in philosophy. But it would appear that we are pre-designed to recognize complexity. Now, why would God do that? Why do you think God would do that? What was that? We're like him? Okay. I was thinking of something else, but yes, what else? See the complexity and understand where it came from. Right. So it's sort of like a painting where we have a Rembrandt and we have a painting done by a 6-year-old child. We know, we can see the intelligence, because of the complexity, because of the orderliness, because of the beauty maybe. We're pre-programmed to do that. You don't have to have a course on that. In fact, you probably have to have a course to understand abstract art, but that's another topic. Some abstract art, I'm not sure they're going in the right direction. But, so we're pre-programmed to recognize the signature of God. He's pre-programmed us. This is a complex mousetrap. And this is a mousetrap that's less complex, like we do them. And here I have, this is not that Quebec mice are like massive and mutates. This is a rat trap. So, we're going to explain what irreducible complexity is with this. This is a little mouse, fake mouse. Okay, so tell me, someone name the parts here. We did this last night, but tell me, someone who wasn't here last night, name some of the parts in this. Just shout them out. Spring, yeah, we got a spring. Block of wood, yes. Trigger, I guess that would be this. What else? The what? Bait, yeah, I don't have the bait. That would be the bait holder or the bait. And of course, there's the clamp, right, to swap down. Now, if I remove the spring, does it still work? The clamp? The wood? The trigger? The bait? Not really. So that means it has an irreducible complexity. It has a complexity, it's simple, but it has a complexity, but you can't reduce it. Whenever you find irreducible complexity, it means there's a creator. Because someone had to, I've never seen evolutionists suggest that this 6-part mousetrap came about through billions of years of chance. Never. Has 6 parts. Now, interestingly enough, I have had them say that this mouse, which has how many parts? Trillions of parts. Okay, this mouse is really complex. DNA code, a lymphatic system, a reproductive system, a muscular system, a nervous system, ocular system. We could go on a lot of systems. And this has trillion parts. It's the product of chance. This has 6 parts. It's the product of intelligence. That's chance. That's intelligence. I haven't quite figured out that. I've worked at it for many years. And I haven't figured that one out. But, that being said, let's look at this situation, analogy situation. So, if it can't be reduced, it has to be. So let's talk about the tails, the flagellum in the bacteria. So here you have bacteria, E. coli, they're inside your gut, inside your intestines, and they help you digest. And these little propellers, they have 40 to 200 all around the cell. These flagellum turn at up to 100,000 revolutions per minute, stop on a quarter turn. They basically look like a drill. This is an electron microscope picture of one. So you have the cytoplasmic membrane, so you have the cell membrane. It has a bushing, a rod, an S-ring. For those of us who know a bit about engineering, this is like your drill, like a common drill. And it has a protein shunt, moves proteins in, and this thing turns either directions. But for this to be useful, of course, it has to be connected to something. It has to have a purpose. So for the purpose to work, you have to have it actually go digest information. They aren't like this. They aren't all on the end, but this is just for picture. So on the membrane, you have to have places on the cell which analyze what's outside the cell. Because the reason for the propellers is to move the bacteria to a place where it gets elements to use, digest. So it has to send that information to somewhere that, as far as I know, we don't know. This is a black box. We don't know where it goes. But the information has to be digested somewhere and then sent off to the right propellers to make them turn at the right speed in the right direction. Wow, this sounds complicated. This sounds really advanced. Laurence, you're not giving us a chance. You're taking the hardest thing possible. In fact, if we were to describe it, it would be this way. Who would have imagined, from Current Biology 2005, who would have imagined receptor complexes that count molecules and make temporal comparisons, activation of a diffusible signal that couples receptors to flagella, reversible rotary engines that derive propellers of variable pitch, force generators, rotors, drive shafts, pushings, and universal joints, a system with prodigious sensitivity with amplification generated by receptor-receptor interactions. You ready for the test? from Yale University. It says it runs like a battery, moves like a ship's propeller, has a gear which can rotate in either direction, and it's under the control of the information of the environment. These are biological functions at their, at their what? Most simplified form. I'm telling you about something we can't go any simpler in biology. It already has 60 parts. And that doesn't explain all the infrastructure to get the parts. What they've discovered is genes, they used to think that there are a lot of repeating codes. They said, well, these are junk genes. These are left over from evolution. But what they found out is you have the gene for the protein, that codes for the protein, and then you have 100 times that code for the infrastructure. How does that work? Well, you're sitting on a chair. That chair is made of material. It's made of foam. It's made of metal, plastics. All these processes have to start with an original element, right? You have to get a mine, or you have to get some animals. You have to put these together. You have a process. You have to color it. You understand? That's all infrastructure to end up with that little simple chair you have. It takes a lot more information than just like the IKEA. Do you have IKEA here? Like the IKEA, thing for putting together, that you already have all the parts. But where did the IKEA get their parts, and where did their sub-suppliers get their parts? You understand? You got to go back to the blueprints, and then you got to build the factories. They're called mitochondria. You got to build the factories, and it gets on. So they found out that no longer do we have any junk genes. It's like we just didn't know what they did before. And so they found out recently that there's a clutch. So the bacteria can unhook the turning so that it can roll down microbiological film. And this is the simplest. And the more it gets less. Notice this is how they answer. Evolution myths. This is what they say. The bacterioflagellum is irreducibly complex. So I am quoting here from the internet an evolutionist who says, we're going to answer that argument. This is his answer. Let's read it carefully. It has been proposed that the flagellum originated from a protein export system. Over time, this system might have been adapted to attach a bacterium to a surface by extruding an adhesive filament. An ion-powered pump for expelling substances from the cell might then have mutated to form the basis of a rotary motor. Proposed, might. The pump just appeared? Adhesive filament? Why did it have to do that? The bacteria was surviving well before, apparently. How does that make any sense? That's the best they've got as an answer. Not very sure of themselves. Proposed, but has no value since there's no scientific substantiation for the two mites. Okay. We get to the end now. Biology is in a privileged position in the study of complexity of all living systems. Even the most simple, as I've just shown, are complex. We can get much more complex, of course. Biological systems are all complex systems. That's a fact. Complex systems appear only from intelligent causes. That's a fact. Okay. Biological systems exist because of an intelligent cause. That's a direct and rational deduction. It's not religious for me to say that this computer has been created. That's not a belief. If I try to say who created it, that might be religious. But in a secular system, it's just normal that we would say we've been created. If I start defining who, that may go beyond the realms of a secular system. But do you understand what I'm saying? It should not be a problem to say I'm created. That's just a rational and logical deduction of what we know in science today. So we've gone through this really quickly. You survived. Here's why the theory of evolution is not scientific. First, it's against fundamental scientific laws. The law of biogenesis. Life comes from life. So how did life come from non-life, right? It's against observation. We can't see it in the fossils. I didn't tell you about probability, but it's obviously mathematically improbable. Information comes from outside the system. It's irrefutable. Remember, I've got fossils, it's a proof. I don't have no fossils, it's a proof. There's no known mechanism for the theory. Natural selection doesn't produce anything new. Mutagenesis is always bad. You see, if you're going to propose a mechanism for getting us from a bacteria to here, it better be the predominant mechanism working in nature today. Not what's an exception. But mutations are bad. There's a reason why you put lead on you when you get an x-ray done at a dentist's office, because mutations are not good. Finally, the theory actually appears to be a dogma. That means it's a belief system. It's a belief. So we're not talking about science against faith. We're talking about faith against faith. Does that remind you of a verse in Ephesians? We fight not against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers in high places. This is not a question of science and faith. This is a question of two faiths with different God. One, we're God. The other, the Creator is God. One has no hope. I was recently on Russia TV, and they had me debate an atheist and an evolutionist. And they, in fact, if you go onto the internet, type YouTube, I think if you type Laurence Tisdall, Russia TV or whatever, you'll find it. And for a half hour. And they said, atheism isn't a religion. I said, what are you talking about? Religion, or when I talk about religion, belief systems, answer always the same three questions. Where do we come from? Why are we here? And where are we going? Atheism answers those three questions. We come from nowhere. We're not here for any good reason whatsoever. And we're going nowhere. Now, what kind of message? That's what they want to teach in our schools. You wonder why we have a high suicide rate? It's a depressive message. Thank God that God has built us to recognize His amazing signature in His works that He has done. Let me finish with this. This is just, they say that creationists aren't scientists when basically every branch of science, excluding evolutionary biology, was developed by a believer. And I like this verse very much in Job 12:7-9. But now ask the beasts, and they will teach you. God was speaking to Job. And the birds of the air, and they will tell you. And speak to the earth, and it will teach you. We'll do that the next session. And the fish of the sea, like the coelacanth, will explain to you. Who among all these does not know that the hand of the Lord has done this? Amen. One second. I remembered, even if you didn't. Okay, you ready? We'll see how good you are. I'll put these down. We'll get to the fossils in the next session when I talk about the age of the earth. All right. So, let's see how good you are at hypothesizing. Okay, let's have a vote. Who thinks the one without the white dot, is going to bounce the highest? Just raise your hand. This one, the one that's a little bit bigger, you might say it's bigger. 1, 2, just a few. 3, 4, 5. Okay. Who thinks obviously the one with the white dot is going to bounce the highest? Okay. Who thinks they're going to both bounce the same height? Okay. Who's waiting for the right answer to lift their hands up? It's like half of you. Wow, you guys are really timid. Okay. So let's do this. Let's do the experiment. So we're going to do the one. This is just so you'll see. This is the one with the white dot. Okay, I'll just put it here. So we're going to test this one. Okay. So we'll start it from about this height. Okay, so it was about that height. Now in science, something that happens once isn't scientifically analyzable. So I've got to do it at least twice, right? So we'll do it a second time. And of course, science, even twice, for it to be mathematically statistical, we have to do it 30 times. I'll do it 3 times. Okay. So now maybe next year when Pastor Bruce or when you invite me back, because I will be going to Wakefield, we can do the other one. We can kind of... No? You want to see this one? Now, I noticed there was a difference of opinion. Is anybody sure that they're right? Oh, you are? Okay. Which one is it? What? Which one? Is the one with the dot or without the dot? With the dot. And you? You both have the dot. Okay, you both agree. Who thinks they're wrong? You think they're wrong. Are you sure they're wrong? Because they're sure they're right. You're not sure. Is anybody sure they're wrong? Okay. But you're sure you're not sure. There we go. Fortunately, the Bible talks that you know, which is a good thing. All right. Well, of course, I won't wait till next year to test this, so we'll do the test. Now, you'll see the importance of observation. when we do experiments to establish whether a hypothesis is true right now, because I'll test it now, you see. Oh, maybe we can test it a second time, because you might not have believed what you just saw, and and you want to be really sure. Which shows you what? It shows you that in science, you do not know unless you've seen it.